Welcome back to Jack's Apocalypse. I'm Jack, and if you find this channel for the first time, this is where survival horror stories get the time they deserve. No summaries, no jump cuts, just a story told properly, from the first minute to the last. Today accounts runs long, so find somewhere comfortable and settle in. Hero is not a soldier, not a prepper, not anyone you'd cast as a person who keeps a group of people alive in sealed box. Most people call him Mack. He's 40-year-old, he drives a service truck for a living, and on the day everything fell apart, he was crawling underneath someone else's house checking pipes. This is his account, and this is your next story. So, let's get started.
My name is Malcolm Dwyer. I go by Mack. I've worked in septic and waste system services for 16 years, operating mostly across Colorado and Wyoming. And in that time, I've been inside more expensive properties than I can count without ever being invited through the front door. The work takes you to places that most people won't see from the inside. And usually the people who own those places prefer it that way. You come in through the service entrance. You do what they've hired you to do, and you leave before they have to think about where you've been. That arrangement has suited me fine for most of my career. You stop being bothered by it somewhere around year 4. It becomes the background noise of the job. The call for the Vale estate came in on a Tuesday in mid-October. My dispatcher said it was a waste system inspection on a private mountain property outside Glenwood Springs. Client name, Wallace Vale. Site manager would meet me at the service gate. Address, laminated access badge required. Company uniform. She said it was a 2 to 3 day job, probably more on the easy side. I looked the property up on the county parcel map that evening. 90 plus acres of mountain land, private road access, a 12-foot perimeter fence on the east and south sides, almost no public-facing records beyond the parcel registration and a property tax filing. I loaded the truck the next morning and drove out. The site manager met me at the gate exactly as promised. His name was Patrick. He did not offer a last name. He handed me a laminated site map, clipped my access badge to my jacket, and walked me to the service entrance on the east side of the building without making much conversation. The estate was large, in a way that takes a moment to register. 3 floors, stone facade, copper gutters, a heated driveway with no ice on it despite the temperature, cameras mounted on every corner and on the gate pillars. A man in a dark jacket stood near the main entrance with his hands behind his back, not moving, watching the driveway. He did not acknowledge me. Patrick brought me around to the back, and that was that. The waste system under the estate was not a standard installation. There was a primary recirculation unit about 60 feet below the main foundation, handling the standard residential waste load. But there was also a secondary treatment loop that ran under an annex structure attached to the lower level of the building. Patrick said the annex had been completed about a year earlier, and the secondary loop serviced it. He didn't describe the annex or what it was used for. I asked if I could inspect the secondary loop access point. He said he'd check. He went on his phone for about 4 minutes, came back, and told me the annex access was restricted and I should focus on the primary system for the time being. I did, but I noted in my site log that the secondary loop flow readings were lower than they should be, in a pattern that suggested either a partial blockage or a design parameter I hadn't seen before. I needed the technical spec sheet for that secondary system before I could go further. I spent most of the first day in the primary service tunnels running pressure checks and flow tests on the primary recirculation unit. The equipment was good quality, well maintained, no obvious faults in the primary system. The secondary loop stayed on my list. Patrick said the spec sheet would be sent to me that evening. It wasn't there when I checked my email at the motel. I made a note and went to bed. The motel was a 2-story place off the main road coming into Glenwood Springs. There had been about 8 or 9 other guests when I checked in 2 days prior. On the second night, there were 2 other vehicles in the lot besides mine. The woman at the front desk mentioned it when I walked past after dinner. She said a few guests had checked out early. I asked why. She said there had been something on the news about a hospital in Denver, patients acting strangely, staff getting hurt, something like that. She said she wasn't sure of the details because she'd only caught part of it. She used the word weird twice. I thanked her and went to my room. I turned on the television. There was a segment about Denver General Medical Center, about 8 minutes into the local broadcast. A reported incident in the infectious disease ward. 8 patients involved. 2 staff members had sustained injuries during what the anchor called a behavioral episode. The language was careful and bureaucratic. Possible environmental cause under investigation. Facility protocol in place. No additional public risk at this time. The segment lasted about 90 seconds. After it, the broadcast moved to a weather map. I watched another 40 minutes of news. The Denver story didn't come back. I thought about it for a few minutes, and then I thought about the secondary loop and my missing spec sheet, and then I went to sleep. Day 2. At the estate, the spec sheet still hadn't arrived. Patrick said the building contractor had used a proprietary design, and they were still chasing the documentation from a third party. He looked like he'd slept less than me. I did what I could on the primary system, and noted the secondary loop as unresolved in my site report. Around noon, from my position in the primary service tunnel, I heard raised voices somewhere above me, not close enough to make out words. The sound lasted about 3 minutes and then stopped. Patrick came down the service stairwell 20 minutes after that and told me the family would be vacating the property for a few days and my work would need to pause. He said it without looking directly at me. He said he'd be in touch to reschedule. I started moving my tools to the service bay near the lower entrance. Before I got everything packed, I heard vehicles on the upper driveway. Multiple engines. I stepped outside the service bay door and watched 3 black vehicles pull up to the main entrance from the driveway side. People were loading bags and cases in a hurry. There was a woman I hadn't seen before directing people with short, sharp instructions. The young man in the expensive jacket was on the phone and pacing. The man in the dark jacket from the previous day was directing people into the vehicles with flat, economical gestures. Every person on that driveway was moving faster than the situation seemed to require, and none of them were talking to each other the way people talk when the reason they're leaving is routine. I turned back toward the service gate to get to my truck. That's when I heard the sound from the lower garage. It was not loud. It was a series of heavy, rhythmic impacts against a hollow surface, not quite regular, like something pushing against a door and stopping and doing it again. It went on for about 30 seconds while I stood there listening to it. I kept walking toward the service gate. I was about 10 feet from it when the estate alarm activated. A low-frequency tone, continuous, the kind that comes from a speaker with real power behind it. And a steel panel I had not seen before dropped from above the gate frame. It came down from a housing mounted over the frame and hit the ground with a sound I felt in my feet. I turned around. The man in the dark jacket was standing about 30 feet away in the service lane, looking directly at me. I would learn his name was Dax Kruger. He said my name, or close enough to it that it was clearly meant for me, and he told me to come with him. He said it the way someone states something they have decided is already settled. I asked what was happening. He said the lower garage had been breached by several individuals from the estate grounds, that the panic protocol had triggered automatically, and that the exit was sealed. He said the protocol required the estate owner's biometric confirmation to override, and that the owner was currently in one of those vehicles leaving the property. He said, "Come inside now." I came inside because the gate was sealed behind a steel panel and there was nowhere else to go. We went through a secondary entrance on the ground floor of the main building, then down 2 levels on a service staircase that I hadn't been shown during either of my previous 2 days on site. The walls changed as we went down, from stone and finished plaster to poured concrete. At the bottom of the staircase there was a steel door, standing open, with a biometric panel mounted flush with the wall beside it. Dax pressed his palm to the panel. The panel confirmed. We went through. The door closed behind us with a sound that was different from a regular door, a pressure sound, the kind that comes from a proper seal. The first room was a wide common area, sitting furniture arranged along one wall, a long table with chairs for 10, indirect lighting in a cove around the ceiling perimeter. The floor was hardwood over concrete, which was a detail I noticed because it meant moisture management had been thought about. The air was climate-controlled, very flat and neutral, no outdoor smell at all. To my left, a corridor led toward a section I'd find out about later. To the right was the kitchen entrance and the start of a storage wing. Straight ahead, Another corridor split toward what I'd eventually identify as the personal quarters wing. The whole space was clean and still, and there were 4 other people in it who all turned to look at me when I came through the door. The young man from the driveway was sitting at the table with his phone in both hands, staring at the screen with the fixed concentration of someone waiting for a signal. His name was Ethan Vale. He was 24 years old, the owner's son. His father had gotten into the first vehicle. Ethan had been on a phone call in his quarters when the lockdown triggered and had not made it out. He told me this in a fast, matter-of-fact way, like he was explaining a clerical problem that had gotten out of hand, not a situation that had just sealed him underground. He had the manner of someone very educated who had not yet had much practice dealing with things that don't respond to arguments. A woman in her mid-30s was going through the kitchen cabinets with a notepad, writing down what she found. Her name was Rosa Mendez. She'd worked as assistant to the estate's private chef for about 2 years. She acknowledged me with a single nod and kept working. She did not stop her inventory for the conversation. A woman in her mid-50s sat at the far end of the table with both hands flat on the surface and her eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance. Her name was Carla Webb. She had been head housekeeper at the estate for 7 years. She looked at me when I came in, looked at Dax, looked back at her hands. She did not speak. Near the kitchen door, there was a man in a white chef's coat, mid-40s, French by the accent when he spoke, short grey at the temples, deliberate in his movements. His name was Antoine Bellard, the estate's private chef. He and Rosa had been in the kitchen preparing the midday meal when the lockdown triggered. He'd already started assisting Rosa with the inventory before I arrived. He greeted me by name. I wasn't sure how he knew it, but Patrick had presumably mentioned my work on the site, and information travels quickly in a closed household staff. He shook my hand. Dax moved through the bunker doing a systematic check of each room without explaining what he was doing or inviting anyone to follow. He was gone about 15 minutes. When he came back, he stood at the head of the table and told us what he knew. He said the lower garage had been breached by what appeared to be severely affected individuals from the estate grounds. Origin unknown. Nature of the illness or condition not yet established. He said the panic protocol had sealed all exits to the surface and required the estate owner's biometric to override manually. He said the bunker had a hardened emergency radio receiver that could pick up signals on the emergency band, but that outbound transmission was narrowband only and currently saturated with competing traffic. He said we needed to wait for the owner to initiate the override from outside. Ethan asked how long that would take. Dax said he didn't know. Ethan asked if his father had been reached directly. Dax said contact attempts had been made and none had connected. Rosa asked about food and water. Dax said to continue the inventory she'd already started. Antoine asked about the medical suite. Dax said he would check it and report back. Carla said nothing. I said nothing. I was looking at the door to the utility corridor and thinking about the maintenance documentation I needed to review, and about the secondary loop readings that were still unresolved in my site notes, and about the fact that I was now on the inside of a system I'd only seen from the outside. The food inventory Rosa finished that evening showed approximately 4 months of freeze-dried stock at normal consumption levels for 1 or 2 people. For 6 people, Antoine calculated it at 6 to 7 weeks if managed carefully. That was the first number that mattered. He was precise about it and wrote it in a notebook he kept in the kitchen, dated and itemized. I respected that. The water recycling system was in the lower utility room, and I found the maintenance binder for it on the shelf above the unit. The system pulled from a groundwater inlet, ran the water through a UV sterilization stage and a carbon filter bank, and fed the processed water into a 900-gallon holding tank. The holding tank fed the building's water supply. The carbon filter bank had a rated service life of 90 days under normal use conditions. On the shelf beside the unit, there was exactly 1 spare set of filters. 1 spare set. I stood in the utility room and read that detail twice. Under normal use conditions meant the rated occupancy of the system, which was listed in the binder as 2 to 4 people. We were 6. I did the arithmetic. At 6 people, the filter load ran higher than the rated design, which meant the current filters would degrade faster than the 90-day service life. My estimate was 45 to 55 days before the first set was spent. Swapping to the spare set extended that by another 45 to 55 days under the same load. After that, if we were still here, the carbon filtration stage would be gone, and the system would be running UV sterilization only on water that still carried the compounds the carbon filter was supposed to remove. The water in the tank would still be usable for some purposes, but not reliably safe to drink over an extended period. I wrote the numbers in my own notebook and put the binder back on the shelf. The waste pump for the bunker ran through the secondary loop I'd flagged in my inspection notes 2 days before. On day 2 in the bunker, I finally got a proper look at the secondary loop intake from the inside, and what I found was a dried collar seal on the intake fitting. It was an installation fault of the type that shows up when a system is built and left dormant before it goes into regular use. The seal had been sitting dry for however long the annex had been standing empty before the bunker was put into service. In a normal service context, I would have ordered a replacement part and scheduled a return visit. I didn't have a return visit. I had a maintenance cabinet, a tube of composite sealant, and a clamp from the tool rack. I packed the seal, clamped it, and gave it a workable fix. I estimated 3 to 4 weeks before it needed attention again at our current use load. I told Antoine that evening, because he asked me directly whether there was anything wrong with the pipes. I told him the truth. I did not tell Dax. That was a deliberate choice. I needed to understand how Dax used operational information before I shared any with him. On the evening of day 2, Dax called everyone to the common area and told us a closed environment required structure to function. He said he was taking responsibility for security, exits, and resource allocation based on his contract with the estate and his professional background. Ethan said that his father's estate meant resource decisions were a family matter and that those decisions should wait for his father's authorization. Dax said that until the owner was present and accessible, he was acting in accordance with his training, and that his training told him a group of 6 people in a sealed environment without clear authority would drift toward bad decisions. He said it without raising his voice, without any shift in his expression. Ethan stopped pushing. The others looked at the table. I watched that exchange, and I took 2 things from it. The first was that Dax was not wrong about the logic. A closed space without structure does drift. The second was that the arrangement he'd described put every decision in his hands and nobody else's. He had not proposed a process or a vote or a shared agreement. He had stated a fact about himself. And because the situation was fresh and everyone was still absorbing what had happened in the last few hours, it had gone through without real resistance. I remembered that moment in detail for every day that followed. Dax had the key to the shooting range cabinet in the lower east corridor, 2 tactical shotguns, a bolt-action rifle, and several thousand rounds of various calibers, all in a locked steel case. He said the weapons were for security use, and that he was the appropriate person to manage them, given his background. He was right about that, practically speaking, and I didn't argue it on day 2. What I did note, quietly, and without saying anything to anyone, was the layout of the kitchen, which had a set of heavy chef's knives in a wooden block on the counter, and the maintenance cabinet in the utility room, which had a full set of pipe wrenches, a pry bar, and 2 heavy adjustable torque handles that were solid enough to make anyone think twice. I wasn't planning anything. I was just reading the room the way I always do in unfamiliar spaces. Antoine established meal times from the first full day underground. Breakfast at 7:30 in the morning, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. He ran the kitchen with the same precision he'd presumably used in the estate above, and he maintained that schedule without being asked to. The food was not interesting given what he had to work with, but it was consistent and well-portioned, and he plated it with care. Rosa helped him, and they developed an efficient working rhythm by the 3rd day. Mealtimes were the only point in each day when all 6 of us were in the same room at the same time. For a while, that was as close as we came to something that felt like a functioning group. Ethan tried the emergency radio band at set intervals. He was not getting through in either direction. He picked up 2 partial transmissions in the first 4 days, neither clear enough to decode anything useful from. He reported each one to the group. Dax told him to restrict attempts to a schedule of every 4 hours for 15 minutes, to manage battery draw on the unit. Ethan complied. I watched Ethan comply with everything Dax said in those first days, and it was not because he agreed. It was because he was 24, he was frightened, and he had not yet identified the cost of going along versus the cost of pushing back. At 24, most people haven't run that calculation for real. I spent as much time as I could in the utility room. That was where I was useful, and it was also the one space in the bunker where Dax had no particular operational interest. He understood the weapons cabinet, the biometric locks, the exit controls, the physical layout of rooms and corridors. He did not understand water chemistry or filter service windows, or what happens when a sealed greywater system runs beyond its design parameters for an extended period. I understood those things in detail because that was my work. I started keeping a running log of system readings in a notebook I took from the office shelf near the radio unit. Dates, flow readings, filter condition estimates, wear projections. It was something to do with the hours between system checks, but it was also the beginning of a much more detailed map of the bunker than any floor plan could give you. And right here, before we go further, I want to hear from you. If you were sealed in this bunker by day 4, would you have started pushing back against Dax already? Or would you have done what Mack did? Watched and waited and built your picture of the situation first? Write your answer in the comments down below. I read every single one of them. Alright, back to the story. Day 5, Carla started keeping to herself, in a way that stood out even given the circumstances. She had always been quiet and self-contained, but there's a difference between a person who is reserved by nature and a person who is withdrawing from a shared space deliberately. By day 5, Carla was keeping her right hand in her lap, or tucked against her side whenever she was seated at the common table. She was eating about half of what Antoine put in front of her. She was not making the small, routine conversations that she'd kept up through the first 4 days. Rosa noticed it before I did, and mentioned it to me quietly one morning while Antoine was managing lunch. I walked past Carla in the main corridor that afternoon. I slowed because she was favoring her right side in a way that stood out. A careful, deliberate kind of movement that people use when something hurts and they don't want it to show. I asked if she was all right. She said yes. Just a scratch. She'd caught her hand on a doorframe in the rush of the lockdown. She pulled her right hand out and showed me the back of it. There was a dressing on it, self-applied, not from the medical suite supplies. Kitchen gauze and medical tape, applied neatly. Carla was meticulous in everything she did. 7 years as a housekeeper will do that to a person, and the dressing was careful and clean. But it was at least 2 days old based on how it looked. I said it seemed like it should be checked properly. She said she'd take care of it. I said okay, and kept walking. But I kept walking with that detail clearly in my head. I found Rosa in the kitchen that evening, and I told her what I'd seen. I described the dressing, its approximate age, the way Carla had been moving. Rosa's expression shifted in a way I didn't like. She told me that on the day of the lockdown, when she and Carla had been running from the staff quarters toward the interior of the building, Carla had stumbled near the lower service entrance and had caught herself on a doorframe. Rosa had seen it happen in the peripheral sense. They were both moving fast, and the light in that corridor was bad. She'd assumed it was a bruise or a scrape. She hadn't thought more about it since that moment. Standing in the kitchen on day 5, she thought more about it. What neither of us said directly was what we were both arriving at. By day 5, even without any formal explanation of what had happened, we all had enough information from the fragmentary radio signals and from what we'd heard through the bunker walls in the first hours to understand that the individuals who had come through the lower garage were not ordinary sick people behaving badly. They were persistent in a way that didn't match any illness category any of us had a word for. Ethan had taken to calling them the affected. Antoine had used the feverheads once, which came from the way they looked, the glassy, unfocused eyes, and the high flush visible even at a distance. Dax called them threats with no qualifier. I hadn't settled on a word yet, and I wasn't going to, until I understood what I was naming. Rosa managed to look at Carla's hand properly the next morning. She came to find me in the utility room afterward, and she closed the door behind her. She said the wound was a bite. She said it plainly and directly, without flinching and without build-up. She said it looked about 5 days old, which matched the timeline of the lockdown exactly. She said there was redness spreading from the dressing edges, and that Carla had a low-grade fever that she'd been managing with the over-the-counter pain relief from the medical suite cabinet. She said Carla had made her promise not to tell anyone. Then she told me, because she understood that not telling anyone was the wrong decision, and she needed someone else to agree with that before she could act on it. The question I had to think through was not whether the group needed to know. They did. The question was how the information got to the group and in what order, because the order mattered. If I went to Dax with this first, he would make a decision, and I already had a clear read on how Dax made decisions. He was efficient in the way that people who see resources and liabilities instead of people are efficient. I wanted the group to hear this together, at the same time, in a room where whatever decision followed could be made in front of everyone, not managed in a private conversation and then announced as a conclusion. I gathered everyone to the common area that evening after dinner, while the plates were still on the table. I told them plainly. I said that Carla had sustained a bite wound during the lockdown, that she had been treating it herself, that there was a developing infection, and that given what we understood about the individuals who had come through the lower garage, we needed to decide together how we were going to handle the situation. I said it once, clearly, and then I looked at Carla. She was looking at the table. She did not deny anything. Ethan went very still. Antoine set down the cup he'd been holding without making a sound. Rosa was already watching the room, reading faces. Dax was quiet for about 10 seconds, which was long for him. Then he said he'd suspected something was off, and that the situation required immediate containment. He used that word with no preamble and no softening. He said there was a quarantine space in the medical suite with a sealed door and a filtration unit, and that Carla should be moved there immediately. He said she should have disclosed this on day one. His voice was the same as it always was. No anger, no hesitation, just the calculation. Carla said she didn't know. She said she hadn't known what it meant on day one. She'd caught her hand in the darkness and the confusion, and she'd thought it was just an animal bite, a cornered estate dog or something wild that had gotten into the garage level in the chaos, because the alternative was something she wasn't ready to face in front of people she'd worked alongside. She said she'd hoped it would just heal. She said she was sorry. She said it quietly, and without drama, and she meant it in a complete way. The kind of apology that doesn't ask for anything back. Antoine said her name once. Rosa reached across the table and put her hand over Carla's. We moved Carla to the quarantine room in the medical suite that night. The room had a cot with a proper mattress, an overhead light on a wall timer, a small air filtration unit that ran off a dedicated circuit, and a window panel in the door made of reinforced acrylic. Rosa carried extra blankets and a change of clothes. Antoine packed a container of portioned food. I checked the lock mechanism. It was a push-bar release from the inside, meaning Carla could open it from her side if she was able to. I noted that. The medical suite had one course of broad-spectrum oral antibiotics. I read the label carefully. It was not specifically matched to whatever was happening in Carla's hand, because we had no way to know what specifically was happening in Carla's hand. But it was the only pharmaceutical option we had, and it was a reasonable first response to a bite wound with developing infection, regardless of the source. Rosa started Carla on the course that night. She also set up a monitoring schedule, someone at the window panel every 2 hours during the day and every 3 hours overnight. Antoine took 3 of the daytime windows. Rosa took the rest. I took the overnight slot at 2 in the morning. Dax said the monitoring schedule was an inefficient use of Rosa's time. I told him the monitoring schedule stayed as written. He looked at me for a moment with the particular expression he used when he was deciding whether a position was worth contesting. He said fine. That was the first direct pushback I'd made against him, and it held, and I noted that too. Day 7, the carbon filter readings dropped out of acceptable range. Not critically, but more sharply than my projections had suggested. I went back through my numbers and found the error. I'd underestimated total daily water use, because the cinema room on the lower level had a dehumidifier running on a circuit I hadn't traced through on day 2. The dehumidifier was pulling moisture from the air and processing it back through the water cycling loop, adding load to the filter bank without adding to any measurement I'd been tracking. I went to the cinema room, disconnected the dehumidifier from the wall, and noted it. That bought time, but not as much as I needed. I checked the spare filter set on the shelf. It was the correct specification for the unit. If I swapped out the current filter bank for the spare set before full degradation, rather than waiting for the first set to fail, I could preserve some useful life in both sets and push the final failure date further out by running them more carefully in sequence. The swap required shutting the recycling system down for about 2 hours, during which the holding tank supply would be running on whatever was already in it, unfiltered by the active circuit. I told Antoine, who told the group, and we organized enough bottled and boiled reserve to cover drinking water and cooking for the swap window. I marked the tap in the utility room clearly. The swap went without trouble. I sealed the spent filter bank in a bin, labeled it with the date, and wrote a new set of projections in my notebook. On day 8, I was running a maintenance test on the grey water disinfection system in the lower utility corridor. The test involved dissolving industrial chlorine tablets in the disinfection chamber, a procedure listed in the maintenance binder for emergency decontamination of the grey water line if contamination was detected. I was following the binder procedure correctly, running the test at the rated dose, ventilating the corridor afterward as specified. What I had not done was put a physical barrier at the corridor entrance. I told Ethan at breakfast that the lower corridor would be off limits until I was finished. He'd nodded. He'd also apparently started using the lower corridor as a shortcut to the kitchen in the last 2 days, and at some point during the test window, before I'd finished ventilating, he came through the entrance from the east end. He got about 6 feet in before the air hit him, and he turned around and went back. He was coughing for a few minutes in the main corridor, and his eyes were irritated for about an hour. He was not harmed at the exposure level he'd received, but it was not a pleasant experience. I went to him afterward and told him directly that I should have put a physical barrier up, and that the error was mine for not doing it. I also told him, as a practical matter, what concentrated chlorine gas does in an enclosed corridor if the exposure level is higher and there's no exit available. I was not thinking about any application of that information when I said it. I was giving him context so he'd understand the severity of what the test was for, but I kept the information in my head, the same way I keep most things I learn about the systems I work on. Dax called me to the common area later that day. He said he'd heard about the incident and wanted to know why I was conducting chemical procedures without informing him first. I said I was following the maintenance documentation for the water systems, which was my operational responsibility in this space, and that the procedure was routine. He said anything involving the air or water quality in the bunker affected everyone, and that he expected to be informed of significant maintenance procedures in advance. I said I'd note that. We looked at each other across the table for a moment. Neither of us said what we were actually discussing, which was something that had very little to do with chemical procedures. Day 9, Dax revised the food rationing. He called it a recalculation based on updated occupancy and activity levels. The new daily caloric allocations he announced put him at full ration, put Ethan at full ration as the property owner's representative, reduced Antoine's allocation on the basis that kitchen work was sedentary, reduced Rosa's allocation on the same basis, and kept my allocation at the standard level because of the physical nature of utility work. He made no mention of Carla's ongoing allocation, which Rosa had been continuing to pass through the medical suite window panel on her own initiative. Antoine pushed back on this directly and professionally. He said caloric allocations in a shared survival environment should be based on actual need, not on a judgment about which work counted as physical, and that as the person managing food preparation, he was in the best position to assess actual consumption requirements. He said this calmly and without accusation, one professional making a case to another. Dax said the decision had been made and would stand. Antoine said with respect, it had not been made through any process that included the rest of the group. Dax said, I am the decision-making authority in this space. He said it without any emphasis at all, and that absence of emphasis was what made it land the way it did. That evening, I found Antoine in the kitchen after dinner, and I told him quietly to keep a parallel record of what was actually being dispensed to each person versus what the official allocation specified. I told him to keep it in the kitchen notebook under the daily menu planning notes. He understood what I meant by that without me spelling it out. He started the record that night. Over the next 3 days, I checked it twice. It was accurate and clear, and it showed exactly what I expected it to show. Let me stop here for a moment. By day 9, Mack has been watching Dax make unilateral decisions about food, about access, about how the group is organized. and Mack keeps choosing to watch and document and wait. I want to know, what would you have done in his position? Would you have moved sooner? Or is the patience the right call? Drop it in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. We go deep on every story on this channel and there's a lot more of this to come. Alright, back to Mack. Day 10. I was in the utility room at 7 in the morning when Rosa came to the door. She didn't say anything when she opened it. She just looked at me, and the look was enough. I went with her to the medical suite corridor. The window panel on Carla's door was covered from the inside with a piece of cloth. Rosa said that when she'd checked at the 6 in the morning rotation, Carla had not been responsive in the way she usually was. She said Carla was moving around the room but in an unfocused pattern, not acknowledging Rosa's voice through the panel, not making eye contact when she faced the door. She said the cloth had appeared over the window between 4 in the morning and 6 in the morning. I went to the window panel. I said Carla's name. After about 15 seconds, the cloth moved and I could see her through it. She was standing about 6 feet back from the door, looking in the general direction of the window but not at it. Her head was tilted slightly. Her eyes did not track when I moved. Her mouth opened once, closed, and she turned away and moved toward the back wall. I stood at the window for about 30 seconds, and then I stepped back. There was nothing useful I was going to get from the window panel. I got the others to the common area, the 3 of us and Ethan. Dax was already in the common area with his coffee when we arrived, which meant he'd either been monitoring the morning or he'd been told by someone. I didn't address that directly. I told the 4 of them what Rosa and I had observed. I told them that the antibiotic course appeared not to have stopped the progression of whatever the bite had introduced, and that what was currently happening in the medical suite was consistent with what we'd seen in the individuals who had come through the lower garage on the day of the lockdown. I told them to be direct with themselves about what that meant going forward. Ethan said it before I finished. She's not coming back to us. He said it quietly, staring at the table, and nobody contradicted him. I went to Dax after the others had dispersed, and I told him the situation in the medical suite had changed significantly, and that we needed to discuss how to proceed. He said he was aware, and that he'd made his own assessment through the window panel earlier that morning. He said the current arrangement was containment, and would remain containment as long as it was effective. He said if it became ineffective, he would handle it. I asked what handle it meant in concrete terms. He said it meant he would ensure the group's safety, and that the details were his responsibility to manage. He said it in the same tone he used to tell us what time breakfast was. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I went back to the utility room. I thought about the sedative ampules he'd taken possession of on day 3. I thought about the captive bolt tool listed in the equipment inventory for the livestock management unit in the lower east section, which I'd found referenced in the documentation, but never tracked down physically because I hadn't needed to until now. I thought about how fast Dax moved through decisions that other people spent significant time on. By that afternoon, without my having been told anything, without any announcement to the group, the medical suite corridor was quiet. Rosa went to the window panel at noon and came back to the kitchen without saying a word to anyone. I didn't ask her what she'd seen. I could read the answer. Day 11. Dax announced at breakfast that Antoine had been identified as a destabilizing influence on group cohesion. He said this with the same flat delivery he used for everything. He said Antoine had been keeping unauthorized records of resource allocation, which Dax had found when he'd gone through the kitchen notebook overnight. He said this constituted a breach of the operating agreement he'd established for the group and represented an adversarial intent toward his authority. Antoine said he'd been keeping accurate records of food distribution as a basic record-keeping measure, which was part of his professional responsibility as the person managing the food stores. Dax said the purpose behind the records was what mattered, not the records themselves, and that the purpose was adversarial. Antoine said that was not an accurate reading of the situation. Dax said the conversation was finished. He told Antoine to come with him. Antoine looked at me across the table. I looked at Dax. I told Dax that nobody in this group was going anywhere under a private escort without the full group knowing where they were going and why. Dax looked at me for a moment, and then he looked at Antoine. He had a hand on Antoine's arm, and he walked him toward the lower storage corridor door without responding to what I'd said. Rosa stood up. I put my arm across in front of her, because I needed to see exactly what Dax was doing before I reacted in a way I couldn't take back. The biometric lock on the storage corridor door activated. Dax came back alone 2 minutes later. He sat down at the table. He said Antoine was in the lower storage section, which had food and water available from the stores, and that he would remain there until Dax was satisfied he was not working against the group's functioning. He said this was a temporary measure. He said it was not a punitive decision but a precautionary one. He picked up his coffee cup. Nobody at the table moved for a moment. Ethan was staring at his hands. Rosa looked at me. I looked at the storage corridor door. I went to the utility room and sat on the floor with my back against the holding tank housing, and I thought for a long time. I thought about the secondary waste loop and where the documentation said it exited the bunker, the maintenance shaft that ran northeast, under the lower grounds, toward the greywater dispersal field, 140 feet from the bunker wall. I'd measured and memorized that number when I first read it in the binder, because that's what I do with measurements. The shaft interior was listed at approximately 20 inches in diameter in the primary run, slightly wider at the junction points. I was not a large person by trade. 16 years in service work keeps a person lean. 20 inches was not comfortable, but it was a passable fit. The shaft access panel was behind the secondary pump housing in the lower utility room. I'd noted it on day 2 when I was mapping the secondary loop from the inside. It was not on the general floor plan document in the binder. It was on the separate service diagram for the secondary loop, which was in the back of the binder in a plastic sleeve that you'd only open if you were looking specifically at the secondary loop. Dax had been through this room multiple times and had never opened the binder because the binder was labeled Greywater System Maintenance Log and had no operational security significance from his perspective. That was the gap. The shaft exit at the dispersal field was a concrete access box set into the lower grounds, with a removable lid at grade level. I had no way to know what was on the other side of that lid without going through the shaft. That was the part of the plan that had no guarantee. What I did know was that the shaft itself was clear of obstructions, and its seal at the bunker end was intact, which I'd confirmed personally when I assessed the secondary loop on day 2. The shaft had been built to house inspection equipment and maintenance personnel. It had been built to be passable. That was enough for what I needed. There were 3 operational problems I needed to solve before the shaft was usable as an exit. The first was Dax's position between me and the shaft access panel, if he was in the utility room or the lower corridor. The second was getting Antoine out of the locked storage section before we moved to the shaft. The third was making sure Dax could not simply follow us into the shaft or get to the surface exit before us, because if he reached the surface first, with the shotgun, the shaft became a dead end. I thought about the power section panel on the utility room wall. According to page 41 of the maintenance binder, the biometric locks in this system held their last state during a power interruption to their section. A locked door stayed locked. An unlocked door stayed unlocked. A door set to free swing stayed on free swing. The lower utility corridor ran on its own power section. If I interrupted power to that section while Dax was in the corridor and could not reach the panel, the corridor lock would hold. He would be in the corridor with limited ability to act on what was happening elsewhere in the bunker. There was another element. The lower garage level above the bunker's northeast section had been the breach point on day 1. The maintenance documentation listed a connecting service passage between the garage level and the bunker's upper east corridor, used for HVAC access when the building was first commissioned. It was sealed with a blast door on the bunker side, operated by the same section panel that managed the utility corridor locks. During a power interruption to that section, the blast door went to its fail state. A 5-second open cycle followed by automatic close. In the 5 seconds between open and close, the passage to the garage level was accessible from whatever was on the other side of it. I had heard enough through the bunker walls in the first 2 days to know the garage level was not empty. I spent most of day 11 writing this in careful sequence in my service notebook, not because I needed it written to remember it, but because I needed to read it back and find the places where it failed. I read it back 3 times. The most likely failure point was the timing. I had to get Rosa and Ethan to the utility room, access the storage section to release Antoine, position all 3 of them at the shaft panel, and get Dax into the lower corridor, all in the right order, before I initiated the sequence. That required everything going right in sequence, without Dax noticing the preparation or the coordination. Day 12. I did 3 things in separate windows during the day. First, I assembled what I'd need for the shaft passage: the headlamp from the emergency equipment shelf, a pry bar small enough to carry alongside me in the shaft, and a pair of waterproof work gloves from the maintenance supply. I put all of this inside the secondary pump housing, between the housing wall and the access panel, where it would be ready. Second, I plugged the drain at the far end of the lower utility corridor with a rubber seal plug I'd pulled from an unused fitting in the utility room earlier that week. The drain plug was flush to the floor and not visible without crouching. Third, I confirmed the location of the independent access branch from the utility room to the east storage section, a service passage that ran behind the main storage corridor and had no biometric assignment because it was a maintenance route, not a residential corridor. Dax had never gone into the east storage section through anything other than the main biometric door, which meant he did not know the branch existed. That evening, after dinner, when Dax had gone to his quarters, I spoke to Rosa and Ethan separately and then together in the utility room. I told them everything: the shaft, the dispersal field exit, the corridor sequence, and what I needed from each of them. I told them the timing would be tight and that once the sequence started, there was no reversing it and no stopping partway through. Rosa asked about Antoine. I told her getting Antoine out of the storage section was step 1 and that the service branch would handle it. Ethan asked whether I was certain about what was outside the shaft exit. I told him I was certain about the shaft itself and that I could not guarantee the surface, but that the surface was better than staying underground indefinitely with the current situation. He looked at the floor for a moment and then he said, "Okay." Ethan asked one more question. He asked how I knew enough about all of this: the building systems, the shaft, the lock behavior on a power cut. I told him I'd been in service work for 16 years. I told him the maintenance room is where the honest information about any building lives, not on the floor plan, not in the summary documentation that gets handed to the owner. The detailed information is in the binder on the shelf that nobody looks at because it only matters when something is broken. He thought about that for a moment. I think it was the first time in his life that someone had explained to him directly that the people doing that kind of work were seeing something about his property that he would never see from his position in it. Day 13. I stayed awake until 1:30 in the morning, running the sequence in my head one final time, and then I got up and started moving. The bunker was as quiet as it ever got. Dax kept his quarters to a consistent schedule. Lights out by 11, the first significant movement not until close to 6 in the morning. That gave me roughly 4.5 hours of working window, though I intended to be through the shaft well before the end of it. The storage section access through the service branch took about 11 minutes from when I entered the utility room to when I reached the east storage section from the branch side. The connection door had a standard push bar release and no biometric, exactly as the service diagram showed. I opened it as quietly as I could manage. Antoine was awake and on his feet. He'd heard movement at the panel and was already standing when the door came open. He looked at me. His face had the particular quality of someone who has spent time alone in a small, uncertain space and is not sure yet whether what they're seeing is real. I handed him a water bottle from my jacket pocket. He drank half of it. I told him in a voice just above a whisper, "We're going through the service shaft under the secondary pump housing. All 4 of us, right now, and we need to be at the shaft panel in the utility room in about 3 minutes." He said understood. He didn't ask questions. He came through the branch connection after me, and we moved through the utility room to where Rosa and Ethan were already waiting. Rosa had a bag. She'd packed it 2 days earlier without telling me. Inside it was the remaining antibiotic stock from the medical suite, which she'd retrieved from the cabinet during a monitoring check, several days of food packs, the first aid kit from the wall mount, and my service notebook. She handed me the notebook without a word. I put it in my jacket pocket. I went to the lower utility corridor and laid the chlorine tablet measure in the drain access chamber at the far end, then confirmed the drain plug was still seated in the drain below it. I checked the ventilation intake setting on the corridor's east wall, which I'd adjusted the previous afternoon, so that the intake pulled from a direction that would concentrate any gas accumulation toward the far corridor end rather than disperse it. I came back to the utility room entrance. I picked up the heaviest torque wrench from the tool rack and I dropped it on the concrete floor. It hit with a sound that carried clearly through the connected corridor and into the main passage. I stepped back into the utility room and I waited. About 35 seconds. Then I heard Dax's quarters door open. Footsteps in the main corridor, steady and deliberate, the way Dax always moved. He moved like a person who has been trained to enter uncertain spaces slowly, checking each side, which was exactly what he was doing, and exactly what I needed him to do. Slower in the corridor meant more time for the tablet chemistry to do its work. I held the utility room door almost to the frame and watched the corridor entrance through the gap. Dax entered the lower utility corridor from the main corridor end, moving carefully, the shotgun in a low carry position. He went about 12 feet in toward the far end, checking the space. I gave him 30 seconds. Then I closed the utility room door fully and went to the power section panel on the wall and cut the circuit to the lower utility corridor section. The lights in that section went dark. From the documentation, I knew the lock on the utility room door would engage on the corridor side, keeping the corridor sealed, and the blast door in the northeast section would cycle through its 5-second open state. I heard the blast door in the northeast wall section open. I heard the sound that came through it in the 5 seconds it was open. I had been hearing variations of that sound through the bunker walls for 13 days, and I knew what it meant. I counted to 12, and then I restored power to the section. The blast door closed. The utility room lock disengaged. I told the others, "Move." Rosa went first because she was the smallest and I needed to confirm the shaft was clear before Ethan went in. She reached the access panel ahead of me, opened it the way I'd shown her, and went in head first without stopping. Ethan followed. Antoine followed. I came last. I pulled the access panel back to its frame as best I could from inside the shaft. It wasn't a perfect seal. It would buy uncertainty about our route rather than definitely block it, and uncertainty was enough. The shaft was exactly what the documentation described. Approximately 20 inches in diameter, concrete construction, a slight rightward curve at about 40 feet in, that I'd anticipated from the service diagram. It smelled the way grey water systems smell. Damp mineral, faint organic compounds, cold flat air. My headlamp showed the curve, and beyond it a straight run disappearing into the dark. I moved on my elbows and knees, keeping my head level, the pry bar scraping occasionally on the wall when I adjusted my grip. The others were shadows ahead of me, moving steadily. About 70 feet in, Rosa stopped. I heard her voice, very low, from ahead of Ethan and Antoine. She said there was a grate directly above her in the shaft ceiling. She said she could hear something above it. I told her to keep moving. She paused for another second, and then she did. Whatever was above the grate, it didn't change in character as we passed beneath it. The sound continued at the same level, and then it was behind us. We kept moving through the dark. The access box at the far end came up faster than I expected. 140 feet sounds longer than it is when you're moving through it. Rosa found the concrete lid, found the recessed handle, and turned it. The lid came up with a low grinding sound from the weight of it. Cold air came in. Genuine outdoor mountain air, the first we'd breathed in 13 days. Rosa pushed the lid fully open and climbed out. Then Ethan, then Antoine. I came up last, lowering the lid back into its frame behind me. We were on the lower estate grounds in the dark. The sky was clear, and the mountain altitude put enough stars overhead that I could read the terrain without the headlamp. The dispersal field was a wide, flat area of frost and gravel, with low scrub around the edges. About 200 feet to the northwest, the main estate building sat dark. No lights in any window. To the south, the garage structure was lower, partially sunken into the hillside, and the large bay door on its near face was standing open. There was movement visible in the ambient light near that opening. I told the group in a low voice to move northeast, away from the building and away from the garage structure, and to stay low and not run unless I gave a specific word. We moved through the frost in a line, with about 6 feet between each person, the way I described to them in the utility room the previous night. Rosa held Antoine's arm. Ethan stayed to my left. Nobody spoke. The ground was uneven under the scrub but manageable. We got to the tree line at approximately 300 feet from the building, and I stopped and turned around to look at the estate. No movement toward us. The garage structure remained focused on whatever was occupying it internally. I exhaled slowly and turned back to the trees. The estate's backup fuel reserve was in a below-grade tank on the south face of the property, beside the generator shed. I'd noted the fill pipe on day one of the original inspection, a standard 6-inch capped pipe in a concrete housing set into the ground near the service gate. The maintenance documentation listed the tank at 1,200 gallons of diesel supply, with the generator running the bunker's full electrical load, including the air systems, the water recycling unit, the lighting, and the blast door controls. Before I'd left the utility room, I'd done one last thing at the secondary panel. The overflow bypass valve on the main fuel line, the one listed in the binder as an emergency shutoff for pump protection, could be opened from that panel. In the open position, with the generator running, it recirculated the fuel line at a pressure beyond the pump's rated tolerance. The binder's consequence notation for that condition read, pump seal failure and uncontrolled fuel line release. I don't know the exact elapsed time between my flipping that valve and what we saw from the tree line. We were roughly 250 yards into the trees when the generator shed went bright. It was not a single dramatic event. It was a rapid sustained burn that lit the south side of the building and sent a dense black column rising against the dark sky. The concussive sound rolled across the mountain and settled into an echo in the tree line and then faded. After that, the bunker had no generator power, no active air cycling, no water recycling, no biometric lock function, no blast door controls. Whatever was in there was going to stay in there. We stood in the trees and watched the south face of the building burn for several minutes. The main structure was stone and concrete, and it wasn't going to come down. But without power, a sealed concrete underground space becomes uninhabitable at a pace measured in hours, not days. Nobody was going back into that bunker. I'd made sure of that. I'd made sure of it for the same reason I'd made sure to seal the shaft panel behind us and drain the maintenance records from the binder into my own notebook, because the bunker was the kind of resource that attracts exactly the kind of decisions that had nearly gotten all of us permanently buried in it. One more pause before we get to the end of this. Mack just burned the exits behind him and walked out into an unknown situation on a mountain in the middle of an outbreak with no plan beyond the next mile. I want to know, was overloading that fuel reserve the right call, or did he take something from the people who came after that might have mattered? Write it in the comments. And if this story has been worth your time, hit subscribe and share it with someone who'd want to hear it. Alright, here's the end. We spent the remainder of that night in the trees. Rosa had organized the bag well enough that we had food and water and a functional first aid kit for several days of conservative use. When the first grey light came at around 5:40 in the morning, I stood at the tree line and studied the estate. The south section was charred and dark. The rest of the building was standing. No visible movement on the exterior. No response from any direction on the property or the road below it. We were, as far as I could determine, alone on that mountainside. Ethan sat with his back against a tree and his arms on his knees for about 20 minutes, just looking at the building. He didn't speak. I didn't push him. Rosa and Antoine were organizing the food pack distribution a few feet away, counting days and portions the way Antoine always approached food, systematically, without drama. I sat down about 10 feet from Ethan and looked at the building with him for a while. I thought about Carla. I thought about Patrick, the site manager, who'd handed me the laminated map and said he'd check on the annex access and had never come back with an answer. I thought about the spec sheet for the secondary loop that I'd asked for on day one and that had never arrived. I thought about how a single piece of documentation, delivered on time, might have meant I was in my truck on the road to another job when all of this started. Ethan eventually spoke. He asked what we were supposed to do now. I told him we walk. He asked which direction. I said northeast toward the main road, down the mountain. He asked if there would be anything useful there. I said I didn't know. He asked what I thought the probability was. I said I thought the probability of finding something useful by moving was higher than the probability of finding it by staying where we were. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up. Rosa spread the topographic map on the ground, and we looked at it together. It was the paper map from the utility room wall mount, the one I'd noted on day 3 when I was mapping what was in the room. The main road northeast was about 4 miles of mountain terrain from where we stood. There was also a secondary access road that split from the estate's private drive and ran to a smaller residential area about 2 miles out. Fewer properties, less traffic historically, more likely to still have something usable that hadn't been overrun in the first days of whatever this was. We agreed on that route. Rosa folded the map and put it in the bag. We left the tree line at first full light and moved northeast through the scrub and the rocky slope. The terrain was rough but not technical. Rosa set the pace and it was right. Sustainable, not urgent. Antoine moved well despite the days in the storage section. His stamina held, and he kept his own counsel about the condition he'd been in, which I respected. Ethan kept up without complaint. I carried the bag because I had the most practice moving over rough ground in work boots. About a mile from the estate, we came over a low ridge and saw smoke in the direction of Glenwood Springs. Not the column from the generator shed, which had already died down. Different smoke, lower and wider, and in multiple locations. The kind of smoke that comes from fires nobody is putting out. We looked at it for about 30 seconds, and then we kept walking. 2 miles out, we found a single-story ranch house set back from the secondary access road. Truck in the driveway, no lights, no visible movement. Rosa knocked at the front door, no response. We went around to the back. The rear door was unlocked. The house had been left in a hurry, drawers open, a travel bag half-packed on the kitchen table, as if someone had started and then changed their mind about what to take. The refrigerator was running. The tap water was running. I turned on the kitchen tap and let it run for a full minute before anyone used it. Antoine found a pot and a burner. We sat at the kitchen table and ate a real meal for the first time in almost 2 weeks. I'm not going to give this account an ending it doesn't have. There was no rescue, no convoy coming up the mountain road to collect survivors and bring them somewhere safe. There was no explanation broadcast on a working channel telling us what the turns were, or where they'd come from, or how to stop it. There was a ranch house with a working tap, and a truck with the keys on the kitchen counter, and 3 other people sitting across the table from me, who had come out of a sealed box under a mountain, because the waste plumbing and grey water systems were in worse shape than they appeared. Fires were burning in the direction of town. The sounds we'd learned to identify over 13 days in the bunker were present on the morning air and getting no quieter. We'd need to keep moving. What I know, putting this account together now, is that the bunker was not what saved us. The bunker was a sealed box with very good locks and a shelf full of equipment that most of the people in it didn't understand. I understood it because I'd spent 16 years learning how the expensive machinery inside expensive properties works from the service side, from the angle that nobody at the owner's table ever looks at it from. That knowledge is not a heroic thing. It's a practical thing. It's the thing you accumulate when your job is to know what's actually keeping a system running, rather than what looks impressive on a specification sheet. The people who built the Vale bunker built it to protect one family and one family's concerns. They hired the right contractors for the cinema room and the wine vault and the biometric security core. They hired me to check pipes. They gave me a laminated badge and a site map and told me the annex access was restricted. They thought about what was worth protecting, and they drew a line. And everything they thought didn't matter, they put on my side of it. In the end, the only things that got 4 people out of that bunker were knowing which shaft ran under the foundation and how long the filters had left and which valve to open on your way out the door. None of those things were on the tour. And that is where Mack's account ends. 4 people, a ranch house, a truck with keys on the counter, and a mountain road going northeast. No inheritance, no secret facility with answers, no authority arriving to confirm that anyone had done something right. Just a working man who knew which pipes went where and refused to let other people's assumptions about who matters become the final word on the subject. That's it for this episode of Jack's Nightmares. If this one stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me which moment landed hardest. Was it the bunker, the shaft, the decision to open that bypass valve on the way out? I want to know what you're thinking. If you're new here, there's a full archive going back a long way, and every story on this channel gets the time it deserves. Hit subscribe, Share this one with someone who'd want to hear it, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.